Hello, historians, and welcome to the first of these discussions, lectures, whatever you want to call them, on the United States since 1945. And so we're going to be talking about all of American history over the next, during this series of lectures, from the end of World War II all the way up through, well, we'll get as close to the present day as we possibly can. For today, we're going to focus on the beginning of the Cold War, right after the end of World War II. But before we talk about the early days of the Cold War, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the contexts, that's a hard word to say, the contexts in which the Cold War developed in the immediate aftermath of World War II, which means we're going to have to go back in time a little bit. And that's the thing about history, is that even though this course is on U.S. since 1945, a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about has long-running roots into the deeper past, going back into the World War II, back to even the turn of the 20th century, and in some ways all the way back to the 19th and even the 18th centuries. But we will touch on that a bit as we move along here. But for today, focusing on the origins of the Cold War, we're going to talk about the ideological context of this Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which ended up affecting much of the world. We'll talk about the historical context, the rhetorical context. We're going to talk very briefly about some of the early American efforts to fight this Cold War, which is the policy of containment for the most part. And then we're going to talk about the effects of all of this at home, politically and ideologically. So I'm going to move through this very quickly. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about different events or different writings or anything. However, as I go along, I will mention specific documents and specific people that you should be paying attention to. And then at the bottom, or on the YouTube page, in the episode notes and in the course notes, I will post links to all of the documents and all of the people that I'm talking about here so that you can do some additional reading. The reading will help you to understand why the Cold War comes about, and reading it in the original documents will give you a much better vision of how everything was working than it would if I was to sit here for an hour summarizing all of the various documents, because that gets very boring, and it's better to go read the original documents anyway. You guys are historians in training, so you should be reading the original documents anyway. So, let's get going here. The ideological context of the Cold War. Now, the ideological part of it comes out of this rise of a bunch of isms that developed in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. What had happened was, in the late 19th century, in the United States, we went through a Gilded Age where there was a vast inequality of wealth, vast income disparities and all of that. And that happened in other places around the world also. The rise of industrialization made some people very rich and made some people very poor. And in some ways, working conditions got better in this new industrial era. In many ways, working conditions got worse in this new industrial era. And so there was this sense around the world in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s that there's a crisis, and there needs to be a way to engineer change so that more people benefit from this new industrialized world than had been benefiting before. And then, of course, when you get into the 1920s and 1930s, you throw in a massive worldwide economic depression, and you start to have more people looking for alternative systems of government, alternative financial systems, economic systems, looking for some other way, because capitalism really wasn't looking all that good. When you go from the Gilded Age into the Great Depression, capitalism has a lot of cons. And so people start looking for other systems that have a lot of pros to them. Socialism Communism were born out of that ferment. I mean, granted, these ideas go back a bit farther than the industrial wave of the late 1800s, early 1900s, but they became much more popular during that industrialized era. And so, but I want to spend a minute just talking about these different isms and how they compare and how they contrast, because we hear these terms even thrown around a lot today without a whole lot of understanding of exactly what these terms mean. So, let's talk about socialism first. Socialism is actually going to play a relatively small role in the rest of the course because it wasn't, the Soviet Union wasn't a socialist system, even though socialist was in their name. They were a communist system. But I want to just spend a minute talking about the kind of the nuances of socialism and communism to hopefully give you a sense of what's happening and what the United States is responding to. So socialism, the general conceit of socialism is, from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution, which means it's not the government's going to provide everything to everybody. There is room within socialism for individual property rights. There is room within socialism for different income levels. There are different classes within a socialist system. They're not as unequal as they were, say, in Gilded Age America. So the classes, there's not as much difference between classes in a socialist system as there is in, say, a completely free market capitalist system. But there are the existence of classes. There is individual property rights. It's just that when it comes to manufacturing capability, like factories and all of that, those things are owned by everybody, and so the profits are going to get shared to everybody based on that person's contributions to society. Not just, a blank check written to everybody. It's always given to who is deserving of it. So, in order to coordinate all that, of course, you do have to have a centralized government. However, under a socialist system, it is going to be a democratically elected government, which is going to be responsive to the will of the people. So that's going to hopefully provide a check and balance on the distribution of resources. You've got a democratically elected government doing it. Under socialism, you've got freedom of religion. Socialists also believe that this is something that's going to happen over time. And that people are going to just naturally develop. It's not going to be a violent revolution. Socialists aren't looking to overthrow capitalism. They're just looking for incremental change within capitalism to make it better, make it more equitable, and hopefully reduce some of the tensions that come out of vast class differences. So that's socialism. Communism takes socialism to the next level. Communists believe that it is going to come through a violent revolution. It's going to overthrow the free market system. It's even going to overthrow the socialist system, because in a communist society, the government is going to provide everything to everyone. There's no individual property rights. The state owns the means of production, not the people. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference that in socialism, the people all own everything and they share the profits. In communist, the government owns everything. The government gets the profits, and then the government distributes those profits as the government sees fit. However, in a true communist system, there should be no classes because everybody's the same. There's no need for money. There's no need for political parties. There's not even a need for a nation, because you've got all people working together for the betterment of everybody, is the thinking behind communism anyway. You have to have a much more powerful centralized government than you do under socialism, because the communist centralized government is going to be in charge of all aspects of everybody's life. And so that means a lot more power, a lot more powers, and a lot more control over people's everyday lives than it is in socialism. Communism, there's no freedom of religion in communism because you don't need to have competing ideologies. Under a communist system, everybody has the same ideological view. Socialism allows for a more diverse ideological spectrum. Communism does not. Everybody needs to believe the same thing, and religion throws a monkey wrench into all of that. So religion is not allowed in a communist system. Now, this is where it gets even more complicated, because the system of communism that I just explained is not the communism that ever actually existed in the real world. That's the communism of, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels writing back in the 19th century. We can call that communism as it existed on paper. Communism as it existed in reality was, of course, much different. In the Soviet Union, which we're going to use as our example here because that's going to be playing a role throughout the rest of our course here, the Soviet Union embraced a different vision of communism than Marx and Engels had ever actually developed. Under the Soviet system, there is a nation because there are non-communist nations out there, which means that you have to have a border. In order to enforce the border, you have to have an army. In order to feed the army, you have to have taxes. You have to, and so basically under Soviet-style communism, you start to develop it's a powerful centralized government, but it's all based around a cult of personality. Who the guy that's in charge is the ultimate leader, and everybody has to obey that person because that person is the one that's protecting us, the communists, from outside attack. And so the leader of the Soviet Union has to be given full authority and full war-making powers and the full ability to do basically whatever he wants. And it's always a him, so whatever he wants. So Soviet-style communism, you do end up with different classes because you've got a party that is built around the leader. You've got a sense of nationalism, which is not supposed to exist in a pure communism, because in a pure communist system, everybody is equal around the world. And because a pure communism is designed to cover the entire planet. The realities of the planet, though, that not everybody wants to be communist, means that pure communism is never really going to exist in the real world, which is why it only exists on paper. The real world version of communism, though, is in many ways, in the early days anyway, personified by the Soviet Union, which is where you've got one political party. You're not supposed to have political parties in communism. You do have classes because some people are part of that party and some people are not. The people that are in positions of power within that party are going to have more benefits than people that are not in positions of power within that party. So you do have disparity of wealth, which you're not supposed to have in a communist system. So the Soviet version of communism is very different from how it was supposed to exist on paper, which may or may not mean a whole lot to us today, but it is an important point that communism has many forms. And we're going to see this as time goes on because China, for example, is going to become a communist country in 1949. They're going to create a very different vision of communism than the Soviet Union will. And eventually China and the Soviet Union are actually going to go to war for a while in the 60s and 70s. So communism is not a monolithic thing that everybody agrees on. The things I'm listing here, which you can look over, I haven't touched on all of these things, but the things that are listed here are kind of the common threads through communism, but the way they get enacted, the way they play out are very different from country to country, from place to place, even from time to time, because even the Soviets don't agree on communism amongst themselves, and different leaders will bring different visions of communism to power and all of that. So what the point of all of this is that we have a ideological system happening in the Soviet Union, which is very different from the American ideology. Although there are some surprising similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. So, the way the Soviet Union looked compared to the United States, both sides have nationalism. Both sides believe that in the existence of their nation and the importance of the citizen to that nation. That's nationalism. Both sides have political parties. Well, the Soviet Union has one political party. The U.S. has two. There will be a whole bunch of third parties that develop in the United States, but our system of elections, especially the Electoral College, which requires 50% plus one of the vote for the winner, means that you can only have two political parties. A third party is never going to win unless it completely destroys one of the other two existing parties. So anyway, we'll get to that later on. But in the United States, of course, we have a very different economic structure. We've got private ownership of the means of production. Our system in the United States is theoretically run through self-interest, which is based on free competition, supply and demand, all those things that you've heard about in various economics classes and civics classes and all that. None of that stuff exists in the Soviet Union. At least there's not supposed to be. There's huge black markets in the Soviet Union, which kind of follow a lot of capitalist ideas. But the official system at play in the Soviet Union does not resemble the United States in any way. So the Soviet Union has a very powerful centralized government built around one guy. The United States has a decentralized, it's a federalist system where we've got power concentrated at state level and the national level, and then some at the local levels also. So power is much more distributed in the United States. We have a president, obviously, and we've got a Congress that both of those entities exert a lot of political power in the United States, but they are not powerful in the same way as the guy who's at the center of the cult of personality in the Soviet Union. So what I'm getting at is that we've got very stark ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that doesn't just start at the end of World War II. That goes farther back in time. As far back as the Russian Revolution, which is what brought the communists to power in the Soviet Union. The Communist Revolution, which happened during World War I, as you theoretically probably all know, I just said it, brought the communists to power in the Soviet Union, and it also scared the bejesus out of much of the rest of the world, because the anxieties that had fueled the Russian Revolution existed in a lot of other countries around the world, even in the United States. And the progressive era, all of those various reforms that happened during the progressive era, which were intended to limit the power of corporations, increase political power for the average citizen, all of that stuff that happened in the progressive era in the United States was an attempt to try to forestall a communist or a socialist revolution in the United States. The fear was that the Gilded Age had exacerbated anxieties and tensions among the working class so much that there could be an uprising or a rebellion. But in order to stop that rebellion, politicians and professionals and middle class, like journalists and all of them, they advocated for these other policies to help to prevent that type of an uprising. So through democratic means, they enacted things like, working conditions and legalizing unions and stuff like that. But the Soviet Union, or the Russian Revolution, demonstrated what happens when the existing government fails to do that type of thing. And so the Russian Revolution scared everybody, and to the point where the United States actually landed troops in Vladivostok, which is on the far eastern coast of the Soviet Union, in World War II, to try to influence the outcome of the Russian Revolution. It didn't work. The Russian Revolution still happened, and the Americans eventually withdrew, but this set the stage for some tension between the new communist Soviet government and the United States, because it really looked like the United States was trying to interfere with a domestic civil war within the Soviet Union. Of course, that's exactly what the U.S. was doing. But when the other side won, that's going to spark some resentment against the United States, which is going to, in some ways, prompt the Soviet Union to form this group called the Communist International, which is a group dedicated to furthering the communist revolution in other areas around the world. Basically everywhere in the world, Latin America, Asia, and even in the United States. The Communist International was a group funded by the Soviet Union, which was dedicated to the promotion of communist ideals around the world, and their job was to help foment communist rebellions elsewhere. This, of course, became very upsetting to the United States because the U.S. was one of this group's explicit targets. So, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are already a bit suspicious of each other and a bit angry at each other throughout the 19-teens, 20s, into the 1930s. The Great Depression becomes a big talking point for the Soviet Union because the Depression had been caused by the failure of capitalism. And so the Comintern and the Soviet Union really played up the weaknesses of capitalism. And a lot of people around the world during the Great Depression, started embracing communist ideas and socialist ideas to the fear of a lot of Western powers. Again, in the United States, in effort to forestall another potential communist revolution, the Americans elected FDR, whose New Deal programs were attempts to use government resources to try to make life better for Americans who were affected by the Depression by cash distributions, resource distributions, job distribution, and all of that. So the New Deal was an effort to try to stop a communist revolution in the United States. We can debate all day whether the New Deal was effective at helping people or not. I don't really care about that at the moment, but for our purposes, that was an attempt, and a largely successful attempt, to stop a communist revolution in the U.S., because the Comintern and the Soviet Union really thought the Depression was probably the best opportunity to spark rebellion within the U.S. It failed. So that brings us to World War II. And World War II was very formative in the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The World War II was largely started because the Soviet Union went to war with Germany. And the Soviet Union desperately, while they had this Eastern Front battle happening over here against the Germans, they desperately hoped that the Western powers would open a second front over here on the west of Germany to try to pull some of the pressure off of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were losing millions of people a year during this war, which we'll talk more about later. But the Soviets desperately wanted the Western powers to start a invasion from the West. However, and so they kept sending out calls for help. Now, the French, well, the French fell to the Germans, so they couldn't really help all that much. There was the, Free French movement and all that, but they couldn't really help. The British, they couldn't really help on their own either. They were kind of stuck on the island. They couldn't cross the channel because of the Luftwaffe and all of that. And they were getting bombed by, German bombers, V-2 rockets and all that. So the British weren't really able to help. And so everyone was really looking to the United States to help. The Soviets kept sending calls to the Americans to help, but the Americans kept dragging their feet. And this got really, really frustrating for the Soviet Union. It didn't help when you have people like Senator Harry S. Truman, future president, but Senator Harry S. Truman in June of 1941, before Pearl Harbor and before the U.S. got involved, saying things like, if we see that Germany is winning, and we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances, neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. So from the Soviet perspective, the Americans are not going to get involved. In fact, the Americans want the Soviets to suffer in this war against the Germans. Now, Truman's statement here, of course, was not official government policy for the United States, but, later, when this guy became vice president in 1944, that told the Soviets that maybe this actually is kind of an official American policy. And then when the Americans get involved in the war, after Pearl Harbor and all of that, the Soviets hope that the Americans will immediately come land in France somewhere and launch a counterattack against the Germans. However, for the next 3 years, though, instead of doing that, the Americans kind of start tinkering around the periphery here. They go into northern Africa. They go into Italy. The Americans did not launch the invasion of France that the Soviets had hoped for until June of 1944 with the D-Day invasion. So for the 3 years, the Americans kind of tinkered around the edges, which was just infuriating to the Soviet Union, and convinced the Soviets that the Americans were following up on Truman's statement about letting the Soviets and the Germans bleed each other for a while. So coming out of the war, the Soviets were very suspicious of the U.S. The U.S. wasn't real happy with the Soviets either, but they were wartime allies, and so there were the meetings like at the Yalta Conference in February of 45. By February of 45, the writing was on the wall for the Germans, and so basically the U.S., the British, and the Soviets came together to figure out what's the post-war world going to look like. At that Yalta Conference, there was a deal worked out between the Americans and the Soviets where 90 days after the end of the war in Europe, the Soviets would come to the assistance of the U.S. in the Pacific theater against the Japanese. Part of that Yalta Conference also allowed the Soviets to maintain control of Eastern Europe as a buffer state against the Germans again. But the big picture is that there was this agreement made between the U.S. and the Soviets that after 90 days, the Soviets will get to enter the Pacific War and will also probably get some gains out of that. At least that's the Soviet hope. But then, like 2 days before that 90 days was up, the United States lit off those atomic bombs in Japan that ended the war, which prevented the Soviet Union from entering into that theater, prevented the Soviets from gaining any of those potential benefits that they had hoped to get, land, former colonies of the Western powers, that kind of thing. So the atomic bombs brought an end to World War II. The Soviets are very suspicious of the United States. The Americans are suspicious because of things like the Communist International, but they're going to get much more suspicious when we start entering kind of the rhetorical period that I'm talking about here, which is the immediate aftermath of World War II. In February of 46, for example, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, came out and gave this speech where he talked about how that Great War, where the Soviets had lost something like 25 million people. That war was the inevitable result of the development of world economic and political forces on the basis of modern monopoly capitalism. So Stalin comes out blazing against his wartime allies, blaming capitalism for World War II, with the implicit idea that if the world was to embrace Soviet-style communism, you wouldn't see those types of wars anymore. Capitalism, and it's not just American capitalism, he's also blaming capitalism as it existed in Germany before World War II. The fascist regime that existed in Germany prided itself on being a capitalist system, and that didn't register well with the Soviets. So, again, I'm gonna blaze through a bunch of different speeches and all that here. I'm not gonna go into too much detail. I've got links for all of these documents down below in the course shell and in the YouTube comments. So take a look at those to get more information. But basically, we've got this speech from Stalin in February of 46, blaming capitalism. A couple months later, you've got Winston Churchill giving a speech in the United States where he talks about how this Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, separating the free states of the West from the slave states of the East, those Eastern nations being dominated by the Soviet Union, the Western nations being dominated by the US, Britain, and France, but also theoretically by democracy and all of that. So Churchill making this speech, which kind of terrifies everybody because nobody had really conceptualized it this way, that there was an Iron Curtain descending over Europe, and that's very ominous. The Soviets are curious about American intentions and American capabilities, and so the Soviet ambassador to the United States, this guy named Nikolai Novikov, wrote a very long telegram in September of 46 outlining the American intentions and capabilities as he saw them anyway. And basically his perspective was that the United States intends to take over the world, and because of the atomic bomb and all that, has the capability to do it. You can read that document to get more details, but this really puts the fear into the Soviet Union that the Americans are dangerous. Same thing is happening from the American side. An American diplomat in Moscow, George Kennan, sends back a telegram to the United States State Department in February of 46, which is a little bit earlier than Novikov's telegram, where he tried to outline the Soviet intentions and capabilities. And according to George Kennan, the Soviet intentions are to take over the world. So it's basically the mirror image of the Novikov telegram. The Soviets don't have the atomic bomb at this point, but they do have the largest standing army in the world at that point. And so Kennan's fear, as he puts it in the telegram, is that they want to take over the world. They probably can because they've got the boots on the ground that can do it. So the U.S. really needs to pump up its response. And the response that's going to take became known as the policy of containment, which was first put forth in the Truman Doctrine, which I have linked down below, which is a speech given by Harry Truman in March of 47 to Congress, where he outlines this new American role in the developing Cold War. The U.S. is there to prevent the expansion of communism because communism is dangerous. So, again, read that document for more details. The Marshall Plan, which came out a couple months after the Truman Doctrine, is another way of accomplishing the same goals. The U.S. is going to pump a whole bunch of money into Europe to help it to rebuild, but the catch, of course, is that the new rebuilt country has to favor the United States. And the U.S. offered this money to everybody, including the Soviet Union, but of course the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, of course, refused the money because they did not want to be beholden to the United States afterwards. So, the Marshall Plan, again, I've got that speech linked down below also. So take a look at that to get a sense of what was happening there. National Security Act created a new permanent military footing for the United States. Before World War II, there never was an intelligence agency that was a full-time intelligence agency. There was no full-time National Security Council, National Security Agency. There were military branches. There was an army and a navy, but they were But when we were not actively at war, they were demobilized, meaning they were shrunk down to a skeleton force, basically. Very little funding. But in the aftermath of World War II, we're going to create this new system where there's going to be widespread funding for a very robust military that is able to provide a response anywhere in the world. So basically, that Truman Doctrine idea where we're going to prevent the expansion of communism, now we're going to permanently fund a military intelligence complex that will be able to identify those threats and respond to those threats anywhere they develop around the world. The American kind of Cold War policies really became codified in a document in 1950 called NSC 68, National Security Council Document number 68, which made a bunch of recommendations for how the U.S. should prosecute this Cold War, where we need to increase defense spending, we need to expand the military budget, we need to develop new types of atomic and nuclear weaponry, increase our aid to our political and diplomatic allies, and of course do not show any weakness towards the Soviet Union. This document is one of the most important foreign policy documents in American history, and so I heartily encourage you to read this document, which I have linked down below. But the general idea that came out in the aftermath of NSC 68 were these Cold War axioms, which are kind of the basic building blocks of the American view of this conflict, which is that America's intentions are always good and our enemy's intentions are always bad. Communism is bad. Communism is expansive and aggressive. Appeasement is also bad. Appeasement didn't work against the Nazis in the run-up to World War II. It was believed that appeasement would not work for the Soviets after World War II. However, all-out war against communism is impossible. By 1950, China had fallen to communism from the American perspective, which meant that the largest physical landmass country in the world, which is the Soviet Union, is communist, and the country with the largest population in the world, which is China, was also communist. In the face of that, an all-out war against communism is not survivable. It's not possible because, like the U.S., a country of, at this point, 200 million people, give or take, the idea that that's going to go to war successfully against the combined might of China and the Soviet Union, not possible, even if we've got the atomic bombs and all of that. Now, in 1949, the Soviets lit off their own atomic bomb, which created that kind of a stalemate. So all-out war against communism is impossible. So we're going to have to fight this through different means. Containment becomes the kind of the word. It had been the word since 1946, 1947, but it gave even more teeth in 1950. The fall of one country to communism threatens all, and so therefore the U.S. is going to have to respond to every communist insurgency and uprising around the world, which is going to drag the U.S. into a whole lot of conflicts that probably were bad ideas. We'll get to those as we move along. Communists have no restraints because they're not beholden to the people. They have unlimited power. The guy that's in charge of the Soviet Union has unlimited power. And so from the American perspective, the Soviets can do whatever they want without the fear of, electoral consequences and all of that. However, the United States does have restraints. We've got a democratically elected system. If we get a power-mad president, that person can be removed from office. We do have ways to do that politically, through impeachment or through elections. The American leaders are beholden to the American people, and so that puts the U.S. militarily at a bit of a disadvantage, from this perspective, because the Soviet Union has unlimited power and is able to do whatever they want. The Americans do not have the ability to do everything we want because we have to answer to our voters and all of that. So these ideas form the basis of American foreign policy and also the view of many just average mainstream Americans and their view of how the world operates. So all of this is at play in the United States. But I'm going to wrap up here by talking about the political consequences of all of this at home in the United States. Now, this right here is the normal ideological spectrum for all of humanity. You've got a moderate middle, And then as you move left from that middle, you get into a bunch of isms like liberalism, socialism, which we talked about before. And then on the far end of the far left end of the ideological spectrum, you've got communism, which I talked about before. As you move to the right from the moderate position, you get things like conservatism, libertarianism, ending in fascism. There's a lot of debate among non-political scientists about communism versus fascism. A lot of people like to argue that, no, fascism belongs on the left also. Or there's some people that argue that, no, communism belongs on the right also, because they're both very authoritarian systems of government. I don't care about that debate. I'm going with the mainstream political scientist view of the political and ideological spectrum. So, what happens, though, so this is the normal ideological spectrum. During World War II, though, in the U.S., we went to war against the Germans, against the fascists, which means that in the United States, the right end of the political spectrum was largely chopped off, because those are the people that the U.S. was at war with. So in the aftermath of World War II, there wasn't much of a far right left in this country. There was still some libertarian organizations. There was the John Birch Society, but nobody paid any attention to them. They were the nutballs of American politics, the people on the far right. And so that end of the political spectrum was largely deleted from American political life in the aftermath of World War II. Then, though, when we go into a Cold War against the Soviet Union, well, the left end of the political spectrum doesn't look so good anymore either. And so, again, there will continue to be communist organizations. There's like the American Communist Party and all of that, but nobody's going to pay attention to them either. And so in the aftermath of World War II, we end up with an ideological system in the United States that is very truncated. Where you've got a little bit of wiggle room on either side of the middle, some who call themselves liberals and some call themselves conservatives, but the extreme ends of the ideological spectrum have been chopped off for the most part. And so during the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, and even into the early 1960s, we have this era which we tend to look back on as kind of a golden age in American politics, where everybody got along. You were able to do big things like interstate highway systems. You were able to do a lot of things, and both sides tended to agree on things. And that is true, politically anyway. It was kind of a golden age of bipartisanship and lack of extremism in American politics and all of that. However, it's important to keep in mind that came at a cost. That came about because of the war against the fascists and the Cold War against the communists. And so there were a lot of people in the United States who didn't really fit into this moderate view, but were not allowed to participate in politics because they had some extreme views. And so as we go on throughout this course, we're going to talk about how this truncated political structure that existed in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s eventually is going to explode. And once you get into the 1960s, 1970s, we're going to suddenly see a lot more activity popping out of the left end of the spectrum and a lot more activity popping out on the right end of the political spectrum, so that eventually we're going to get back to the normal ideological spectrum. But during these early years of the Cold War that we're talking about, there was this truncated political spectrum. And the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that all these people were living under fear of thermonuclear annihilation. That's a pretty big unifier also. A lot of people are incentivized to get along with each other because they know that if we fight amongst each other, that might give the Soviets an opportunity to come in and destroy us. So, this golden age of American politics came at a huge price, and it was happening because of fear of annihilation. It was a fear of, self-preservation and all of that. So, keep that in mind. That's where we are at the beginning of the Cold War. I will post another video next week, and we will go from there. So, have a good week, and I will see you online.